Now, during the interval, we have the ninth of 10 conversations in which the late Dr. Jacob Bronowski related to George Steedman his personal account of the discoveries and philosophies of the 20th century. Last week, Dr. Bronowski considered evolution, and this week he examines a most successful mammal. Dr. Bronowski.
The physical world in general runs down. Any orderly state becomes less orderly as time goes on. It's clear the biological world is different. Disorderly matter, or matter of very low organization, is built up into more complex systems. For instance, the breakfast kipper that I ate earlier today can be demonstrated to be, in many respects, a somewhat simpler form of life than mine as a human being. I am, in an evolutionary sense, a later and more complex animal. So I feed on the kipper builds me up and not the other way about. How does this come about? Life is made up of the same atoms that non-living things are made of. It differs from them only in its architecture, organization.
Its pattern.
Pattern, organization, complexity. So that in a sense, the idea of an evolution of complexity comes in from the very moment you realize that life has this special pattern, which in the higher animals becomes more and more complex. If a creature duplicates itself simply because its cells divide, then the tendency is for the cells to be identical copies of the original. But if a creature has a male and female forms, and the male and female must conjoin, have sexual intercourse, and form a new cell, then that cell will carry some properties from one parent and some from another, genetic properties of the kind first discovered by Mendel. And of course, that makes it a creature with much more potential than one which had only one parent.
Well, it has more individuality, more potential for disaster or success.
Or success. And you see, nature doesn't care about disaster. The disasters are thrown away. Nature just preserves the successes. And one success is worth 1,000,000 disasters. Nature works on that generous scale of continual bankruptcy in order that a few, as it were, millionaires of evolution, richly endowed creatures, shall emerge. As evolution progresses, it not only produces more complex creatures, it actually produces more complex processes, and sex is one of them. Why does life climb up when most of the universe runs down? One ought to start with the building up of any complex structure. A more complex molecule from a simpler one, a more complex atom from a simpler one. Now, that has happened with all living structures. First, things like the amino acids and the nucleic acids. Second, the cell. Think of the beautiful invention of the cell, which started much over 1,000 million years ago, and for ages didn't form very complex creatures, and then nature discovered the trick of putting cells together so that they all have the same equipment, and yet some of them decide to be a nose, and others decide to be an eye, and others decide to be an ear. And you could transplant them and make them be the wrong thing in the wrong way. Some cancers are of that kind. How does that happen? It happens because of that Platonic thing, which is that several simple units put together make a structure which is more stable, more self-organized within itself. There is something about the way that they have been organized which gives them a resistance to disturbing forces which the individual atoms didn't have. Why does a multicellular animal resist the disturbances of nature better than a unicellular animal? Because it is not buffeted about by fate, climate, hot flushes, cold streams, and so on, in the way in which individual cells are. And it's that advantage which a collection of cells takes, and which a more complex animal has over the simpler animal.
When you were talking about the evolution of complexity and saying, in effect, that sexual differentiation, any kind of differentiation, produces wider variety, that nature is aristocratic, it only selects the successful ones and rejects the ones that are not evolving. We forget that also man is a mammal, a vertebrate mammal, and can only survive by huddling together. And is it not simply the lot of man to be constantly in a tension between his individuality and his need to huddle together to survive?
That I would accept as a definition of the peculiar nature of man as a mammal. Yes. I'd like to take you up on that and spell it out more slowly. The mammals are comparatively young as evolutionary history goes. That is to say, that in a range of life that goes back to 3,000 million years, the dinosaurs only died out 100 million years ago. That's when the mammals came in. Of the 100 million years that the mammals have occupied, man has occupied, even if you count comparatively remote man-like ancestors, only the last, let us say, 3, possibly 5 million years. So that's a speck of the total of evolutionary history. Yet man has been enormously successful, just as the mammals wiped out the dinosaurs. Not, I think, by actual tooth-to-tooth combat, but simply by being far more successful. So man is wiping out the other creatures. And I don't mean by going out with guns or not preserving them or killing the whales, but by just being much more successful. As a mammal, what has made man successful? What has made him successful is his lack of specialization. If you take some highly specialized, very exactly fitted animal, like, the ant is a good example. It has built up an insect society which is so perfect that there is really nothing left to change. And so the ants are almost as old as the mammals. I mean, the ants haven't changed for the last 50 million years, certainly. We even know that their social organization is the same, because, you see, fortunately, there exist ants trapped in amber that really are many millions of years old, so we know their aphids and everything. So here we have the ants, who to themselves seem the most successful creatures in the world, and then you say to yourself, well, you're not very successful, you're still scrubbing about there on the earth. You don't know how to fly, you don't know how to swim, you haven't built cities, you haven't written the Bible, you haven't invented an Isaac Newton, and they say to you, Newton, Schmooten, who wants that? We're getting on fine. And you say to them, you think you're getting on fine? And you don't have to step on them. You know, people are very foolish, but they keep on saying, we're killing the animals. We're not killing the animals. They're just dying out because they're not successful by our terms. The ants are not really very successful. They found what ecologists call a niche in which to live. They found a little crevice in which to carry on this monotonous existence, but they had not unfolded into world conquest at all.
They can't live at the South Pole, and man can. They can't fly to the moon, and man can.
That's right. And you see, I want to stress that point, because in a way, all the physics and all the biology we've been talking about so far come to the subject for which I entered science, and on which I wish to leave science. Man himself, the uniqueness of man. An animal is thought to be successful in Darwinian terms when it survives as the fittest. And actually, fittest means the one that produces most progeny by comparison with its neighbor. An animal isn't very fit, it just produces a lot of young, of which more survive. Now turn to human history. In the time that has passed since the founding of the Royal Society, almost exactly 300 years ago, what man has proved himself fittest in all civilization? Isaac Newton, who had no offspring at all, and probably never slept with a woman all his life. In every ordinary biological sense, a most unfit creature. He just happened to be endowed with a kind of brain which solved not a single problem, not even the problem that Hessen talked about sailing society, but universal problems of human thought about how to do mathematics. You say to the ant, you don't know how to do the differential calculus, Newton invented this. And the ant looks at you in surprise, and it keeps on saying, my eggs hatch all right, my kids come out all right, they go off to school, they milk the same aphids, they're doing fine. And I keep on saying, they're not doing fine. Your kids are the same as they were 50 million years ago, and my kids are going to have it better than me. And the ant says, that's a very Jewish attitude. You always want your kids to have it better. I'm content that the kids shall be like me. Well, that's the difference between us. That's the difference between us and the animal world. That we think that the world belongs to the future, and the animals think that the world belongs to the present.
Yes, there's something in the ants. Newton had to have a mother and father to produce a body that would carry his thoughts.
Newton's father died before he was born. In what animal community would he have survived? Even your example, you see, makes my point.
Well, it makes mine, too, that man clings together for protection of the young.
Yes.
And much of that clinging together produces ant-like attitudes.
The last thing I want to say is that man does everything right and the animals do everything wrong. No, I'm stating extremes here. As a matter of fact, man is a very cooperative animal. In that respect, he is much more like the ant than he is, say, like the lion or the robin redbreast. The primates in general, that's the monkeys and the apes and so on, are very cooperative. And anybody who talks about man's aggressive instinct without realizing that the branch of the mammals to which man belongs, namely the monkeys, are very peaceful, cooperative, huddling together animals, and owe their success to that. Anyone who talks about aggression in man is just making the wrong analogy.
You, in your youth, hoped that the subject matter of the arts would become more scientific, that the thought of scientific man would become bridged over to people in the arts. Do you feel this has happened?
Yes, it's happened, although it's happened more in the potential than in the actual. It is not yet true that people who quote scientific analogies understand them any better than they did 100 years ago.
You're really speaking of a gap in knowledge and understanding between the skulls we think we have and those other people who seem to think that such knowledge is not necessary, that it's better to be ignorant than to know.
Quite right. And what is often referred to as the argument about the two cultures rests very much on that. It rests very much on the old phrases going right back to Shelley, that the rainbow loses its colors if you understand how the colors are put together. I'm fundamentally opposed to that. And I'm particularly opposed to it now, in the latter part of the 20th century, because right now, science is beginning to talk about human subject, about, I make as bold as to say, humanism. What do I mean by that? Exactly what we've been talking about in this conversation, about the individuality, about how man owes his place to being an animal which is biologically ill-fitted to the scene around it, and therefore has, by personal experience, to be highly individual.
Perhaps we ought to admit that some of the young people who've been experimenting with LSD and marijuana and hallucinatory drugs are, in a way, pursuing a crude scientific experiment to make real to themselves the fact that if you change the biochemistry, simple chemical molecules can change what man thinks of himself.
Yes, and I wouldn't laugh off their experiments, or I wouldn't encourage anyone to repeat them. On the contrary, I'm impressed by the fact that as soon as the scientific press began to give publicity to the fact that LSD does harm to your brain, and there are other drugs that don't, the use of LSD in American universities dropped like a stone.
Mm.
They may laugh at science in public, but in private they heed its lessons very strongly, and rightly so. Because the more science grapples with the human problems, the better it will be for us all. After all, over and over again we come to this central point that the forms of experience are highly individual. What I am saying, what you hear me as saying, what the third and fourth and fifth person taking mentally part in this conversation on the radio now hears is subtly different, because it's subtly shaped by our experience. When I use the word love, I have a picture of a certain number of girls with whom I have had certain experiences very profound. They can't be identical with yours. The pictures of the girls must be different. And our life consists of an intertwining of the individual element which we contribute and the universal element which we extract and call science. Art, as a mode of knowledge, stresses that individual element, draws the sweetheart so that it's everybody's sweetheart, draws that gorgeous picture by Chagall about the wedding, in which the bridegroom and the bride stand side by side, but on the bride's face there is already the appearance of a very small homunculus, the baby she's not yet conceived, but with which her mind is preoccupied. That's a gorgeous image. That makes for the individuality, that even in the act of love, in the act of marriage, we are both creatures who share and creatures whose experience is highly individual. What has been wonderful about biological science in the second half of the 20th century is that such individuality has become more and more precious and interesting to it, as indeed our conversation today shows.